Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Dr. Khuram and I'm the convener at South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. The topic of our today's webinar is Minorities Under Siege in South Asia. And our speakers are Professor Dr. Manish Madan from USA, Dr. Sir Deshapriya S. Wijetunge from Sri Lanka, Mr. Pradip Pariyar from Nepal, and Ms. Radha Bheel from Pakistan. Now, without further ado, I turn the time over to Professor Dr. Manish Madan. He's the founder of Global Indian Progressive Alliance and Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at Stockton University, New Jersey. Over to you, sir.
So, good morning to my fellow panelists and members in the audience. It is my honor to talk to you all today. I thank the South Asian Research Institute for Minorities, SARIM, and special thanks to Dr. Syed Khuram, Mehdi, for his leadership as a convener and for organizing this panel. Thank you. So, I've been asked to talk about the minorities under siege in South Asia. And there's so much to discuss on this critical topic, and obviously, I commend the organizers for thinking of such an important topic for this discourse. As I was thinking for my talk today, I figured to position it around the few contemporary landmark events that has happened in India, and I'm sure there will be people who will be talking about Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, as we have other speakers. So I'll be focusing more on the Indian aspect here. So when we speak about the minorities under siege, I often ask what the threshold for our community is, where we all sit up and take a notice of the violence, oppression, and or discrimination against the minorities. As Mahatma Gandhi would say, and I quote, "Even if you're a minority of one, the truth is the truth," and I unquote. And by that extension, an oppression against one is an oppression against all, and so goes for the discrimination and violence. So now, while I'll be speaking primarily in the context of minorities in India, the irony is that the minorities under siege is a historical as well as universal global phenomena that we see across our different countries where we belong to. We see it often rooted in hypernationalism, in the polarization and divisiveness, and most often it is also on the lines of human constructs such as race, religion, caste, and social class, what have you. So the question that I address in my talk, and I know I have about 10 minutes, I'll be mindful of the time, is how they are under siege. Is there anything we can learn from the history, and what are the fallouts for such an environment? So a couple of few points. First is that we see that they are under us, minorities can be under siege based on the mindless and thoughtless policies or laws that is brought upon by ruling government, for example, which are not only, like I said, mindless and thoughtless, but also unconstitutional in its core nature. I'll use two examples primarily here, or one to begin with. Some of you may have heard about the Citizenship Amendment Act that the Indian government brought last year. I don't know if I have the ability to share my screen. Do I have the ability to do that? Maybe I can show a couple of slides to explain. Do I have the ability to share my screen? Okay, I can do it. So I'm sharing my screen at this point just to give you a brief glimpse of the Citizenship Amendment Act and how it impacts the minorities in our country. So this is something which the law was brought about in last year in December. It says that any person that belonged to a Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Jain, Parsi, and Christian community, and it categorically excluded Muslims, Jews, or atheists, who have entered into India from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. So mostly bordering countries, although Afghanistan is not a bordering country to India for that matter here, on or before December 31st, 2014, and who have been residing in India, since 5 years leading up to 2014, which means they should have been technically in India from 2009 and before to qualify for this immunity. They will not be treated as illegal immigrants for the purpose of this act, right? So this is the core of this act that brought about, which impacts the minorities in India. And that's why I'm going to bring in this in that context here. So if I explain to you in much simpler terms here, so think about it. Let's say, every country has problem with immigration, with illegal immigration or undocumented people, particularly in countries like South Asia. We have, there's with all the limitations of education, literacy, not everybody will be able to say. And obviously, with the partition happened in 1947, the 1971 happened, which obviously a lot of people came into the country to seek refuge, and all those things created this issue where we are today. So what this law does, and again, in my legal understanding, I find it as absolutely unconstitutional. It is under, obviously, the Supreme Court is still looking into the cases, but I'll explain to you the simpler ways how we do it. So let's imagine there are undocumented people who are 100 undocumented people, right? We take a stock, they're 100 undocumented. Out of that, there are 60 people who happen to be non-Muslims and 40 people who happens to be Muslims in that group of 100 people sample. Comes Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, which has been effective since 10th of January of this year 2020. Now, what happens? The 60 undocumented non-Muslim gain the citizenship because they are no more illegal immigrants for the CAA. But what happens is that, and we appreciate that, it's a humanitarian gesture. We should appreciate that. But what happens is, and which is where the problem and the exception of civil society, public intellectuals, academics, scholars, and activists has been. What happens to the 40 undocumented Muslims? They, based on the CAA, they do not get the citizenship, right? Which is where the condemnation comes here. So the government narrative, it says that they mislead people to appreciate the act of commission, which is what we say. Okay, they're giving citizenship to different groups, which is we appreciate that. I appreciate that personally speaking. But the counter narrative to that is the civil society wants to remind the government to focus on the act of omission, which is the exclusion of Muslims, Jews, or atheists from the act, and which is what the source of the protests were also. So, bringing it back to the idea of the minority under siege, this is one way where the minorities can be under siege, which is where we say that how the government certain regulations or government laws bring also to that effect here. So this is something that again I'll just go over now. So speaking of that, moving forward in that aspect, are there any historical precedents to that which we see here? Based on the if you look at some of the historical aspects here, the religious test, in the Indian context, right, the minorities got under siege due to CA most recently, right, particularly. And I want to use the word siege very judiciously, because when we say the word siege, it kind of creates this whole doom and gloom situation. And I don't want people to get that, but I'm just using that word because that's what the title of our talk is. So whatever the problem, the concerns are, so this Indian government used the religious test as a matter of the Citizenship Amendment Act. Are there any precedents to that, right? So this religious text also harks back to the Nuremberg race laws. Some of you who may have known about the German history, that was promulgated almost by Nazis by almost about 85 years ago, which stripped the German Jews of their citizenship, right? And what it culminated into a ghastly, Holocaust where we understand millions of Jews were exterminated. So those are some really, really serious fallouts or outcomes of this minority under siege when we talk about that. Similarly, one can also look for comparisons at the systems of apartheid in South Africa, which it did? It legitimized the white supremacy and racial segregation by the virtue of this called Native Land Act of 1913. And what it did was it legitimized the discriminatory foundations of South African law by excluding the black South Africans, which is where we saw that how Nelson Mandela fought his entire life to pretty much shun the apartheid from South Africa. So, and finally, the last reference to that historical backdrop is look at the Israeli Citizenship Act of 2018, which was pretty much where I can see that our Indian citizenship law is pretty much modeled around that concept here. What that law did, they also known as the Jewish Nation State Act, right? Which almost discriminates about nearly 20% of its Arab population, which is the minority in the state of Israel. Now, what they do, which is about 9 million people, we're talking about that. What that law does, three things. It says that the right to exercise national self-determination in Israel is unique to the Jewish people. And we see similar narrative now being brought about in India about being a Hindu state. When our foundation is of a very much of a pluralistic, a secular society, secular country since we got independence in 1947. Then it establishes Hebrew as Israel's official language and downgrades Arabic, a language which is widely spoken about by Arab Israelis, which is again a 9 million population we're talking about that, right? So again, so that is something obviously now in India we constantly see a push for making Hindi. And as much as I'm myself am a Hindi speaker, but I respect the fact that my country is a secular country, which allows different languages to exist and coexist. But this is where when you see the push for one language, to say this will be the language of the nation, it becomes a little challenging to see that happening. Then also it establishes the Jewish settlement as a national value and mandates the state will labor to encourage and promote its establishment and development. So again, going back to the whole concept of Hindu Rashtra. So this is the historical background of how we see the minorities have been under siege in different countries based on the government laws that are brought about by the government. Uh, what are the fallouts? And I'll be finishing in the next few minutes. I know my 10 minutes are over soon. So what we see as in terms of the fallout is people to people divisions, right? We see that often happening. You know, I'll take the example of US, for example. In the US also we see the minorities. I won't use the word siege here, but again, the polarization that we see, what has happened is that based on the FBI's annual report, US itself has witnessed a rise in the violent hate crimes and threats. And who did it impact the most? Latino population, the transgender people, or including Jews and the Jewish settlements, were being targeted of this hate crime in the US, right? So again, Jewish being the minorities in this country also to whatever degree it is. Similarly, the Indians, even within America, Indians being the minority have also received some hate crime in that aspect. For example, in 2018, Sikhs were officially the third most targeted group of hate crime. Followed by the anti-Hindu hate crime, which has been remaining stagnant at 1%, and about anti-Muslim bias or hate that we have seen is about ranges from 17 to 18% of the statistics what we see. Coming back to the Indian concept of the fallout here, India has also similarly seen rise in the communal rhetoric, which has been made by national leaders, by using different phrases and what have you. And now what it led to almost when we had, in the past 6 years, for example, minorities have been targeted. We understand that. Whether it's cow lynching, mob lynching incidences, whether it's crime against Dalits, we have seen those happen. And just about in the last 6 years, there was a report for the Human Rights Group report which documented about 44 people were killed in the last 6 years based on mob lynching, and out of which about 82% of the victims were Muslims. Right. So now when you see that 82% of the victims happen to be a Muslim, then clearly you see a pattern of impacting of the violence, of oppression, of discrimination. And again, these are all fatal incidents which we are talking about that. So, and similarly, since 2014, even the Christian minority population, which is about less than a percent or so in India, has also faced increased persecution. Which and there's a organization called Open Door, and based on their annual report, we were about ranked about 30th rank in the world, in terms of religious freedom. But now in the last 7 years, now India has jumped up to the 10th place in the list of countries where Christians suffer, and I quote, extreme persecution. And that's obviously a dangerous trend. Again, we are setting through the minorities. So when we speak about minorities, I want the audience to think about minorities outside the lens of just one religion. It's not just Muslims. It's again anybody who has a less a social capital also to some extent. To that event, even people in the social class who are in the lower in the cadre, right? Whether economically speaking. If we talk about the CAA not only impacts Muslims, we understand that it does obviously, but then it also impacts people, let's say, who are in the Dalit population or tribal population who cannot afford to secure their papers and produce their citizenship, papers and all that. So it is a very universal phenomenon in that process, which we see different groups being targeted. And last point here that I would make before I turn it over is that, what else is promoting this minority under siege concept, right? What adds to that? What adds to it? And what we see is that when media also turns against the minorities, right? So we see that the government is already bringing laws which are against the minorities, which are favoring a certain group or not favoring a certain group for that matter. But then media also does its part. For example, if we talk about the historical precedent first, some of you may have known about the Rwandan genocide in 1994 that happened, which witnessed almost an estimated 1 million death, and it's not a small number, 1 million death almost, with members of the Hutu ethnic majority killing the Tutsis. So there are the two predominant groups here, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Now, Tutsis being the minorities there, a minority ethnic group, right? So what happened? First, people started to dehumanize the Tutsis groups, and where the local media played a part. The local radios, for example, started using the same, started colluding with the government, up till times, and where they started associating Tutsis as Inanzis, which is translated as cockroaches, as an example. They started to call or as snakes, or calling people to exterminate the cockroaches. So you start to use the dehumanizing language against the minorities, and which is where you start to polarize people. And in many ways, what we saw, the 1994 genocide of the Rwanda genocide, we see similar hate mongering in our current political context also, and which is what is amplified by the media, which is where we want to make sure that when we talk about the minorities under siege, we also take in the role of the media that adds fire, to the fury there. And the last thing I would say is that it's also the people to people. At the end of the day, it is people turning against
Wasn't
people.
that?
So we also have to be smart enough or intelligent enough to understand when the polarization happens from different groups, from different political parties, and at the end of the day, we all have to live as a community together. So to that effect, I feel that there is definitely a problem against minorities in different South Asian countries, including in India, which is by the laws. We saw the Kashmir happened, Article 370 happened, which has also brought a lot of human rights violation to that, and obviously the Muslims being the minority in India, it has also impacted our the young children who cannot, let's say, access internet now, right? Because now they can, and the reason the internet is important because now they cannot get educated. So now, due to those bad laws or those bad policies, we are not only impacting the minorities population from a human rights perspective, and again, education being a part of the human rights, we're also kind of almost pushing the generation behind in that aspect. So those are some opening remarks. I appreciate the time and thank you for listening. I will turn it over back to the convener here. Thank you very much.
Very well said by Dr. Manish that minorities can be under siege based on the mindless and thoughtless policies or laws brought upon by the ruling government. Thank you, Dr. Manish. In fact, you have very well defined the impact of Citizenship Amendment Act on minorities. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Ambassador of Peace, Dr. Deshapriya S. Wijetunge. He is the Director General of SUNFO Global Federation, Sri Lanka. Over to you, sir.
So I am very happy and consider as a privilege to share some of my thoughts in this Zoom conference on the invitation of South Asian Research Institute for Minorities. While appreciating your good work and all your attempts to the betterment of minorities, I would like to just start my speech with just mentioning how the South Asian ethnic groups defined. South Asian ethnic groups are ethno-linguistic composition of diverse population of South Asia, including the nations of India, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, the Maldives, and Sri Lanka. Afghans, however, are generally not included among these ethnic groups. The majority of the population fall within three large linguistic groups: Indo-Aryan, Dravidians, and Iranic. These groups are also further subdivided into numerous subgroups according to castes and tribes. So, if you think in India alone, the population is categorized in terms of the over 1,650 mother tongues spoken by those people. Minority groups not falling within either large groups mostly speak languages belongs to the Austroasiatics and Tibeto-Burman languages families. The most live around Ladakh and northeast India, Nepal, Bhutan, and the Chittagong Hill tracts of Bangladesh. The Andamanese live in some of the Andaman Islands and speaks a language isolate, as do the Kushandu in central Nepal. In Sri Lanka, the Vedda and the Nihadi of central India. The people of the Hunsa Valley in Pakistan are another distinct population. They speak Baushikashi, a language isolate. So, in the South Asian regions, the major religions in the subcontinent are Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism, and Christianity. The majority of the people in South Asia practice Hinduism, as we see. The Lord Buddha and several key religious gurus were born in South Asia. So religious values has to be promoted with an approach of interreligious harmony among people in South Asia. Minorities in Sri Lanka, the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka, according to our past census, Buddhists make up to 70.2 of the population. Hindus 12.6, Muslims 9.7, and Christianity 7.6. Most ethnic Sinhalese are Buddhists, most Tamils are Hindus, and the Moors and Malays are mostly Muslims. Sizable minorities of both Sinhalese and Tamils are Christians, most of whom are Roman Catholic. The Moors, descendants of Arab trades, they settled in Sri Lanka and married local women. From the third largest ethnic group at 9.3% of the population now. They are mostly concentrated in urban areas in the southern parts of the island, with substantial population in the central and eastern provinces too. During times of Portuguese colonization, Moors were persecuted and many forced to retreat to the central highlands and the eastern coast, while colonization happened mainly the sea belt at the beginning. There are also Indian Tamils who from a distinct ethnic groups comprising of 4.1% of the population. The British brought them to Sri Lanka in the 19th century as tea and rubber plantation workers, and they remain concentrated in the tea country called the mainly hill areas and also the other parts of south central Sri Lanka. The Indian Tamils of Sri Lanka were considered to be stateless, and over 3 lakhs Indian Tamils were deported back to India due to the agreement between the government of Sri Lanka and the government of India in 1964. Under the fact, India granted citizenship to the remainder, some 200,000 of whom now live in India. Another 75,000 Indian Tamils who themselves or whose parents once applied for Indian citizenship now wish to remain in Sri Lanka. The government has stated these Tamils will not be forced to return to India, although they are not technically citizens of Sri Lanka. By the 1990s, most Indian Tamils had received Sri Lankan citizenship, and some even were not granted Sri Lankan citizenship until 2003. But now it is granted. Smaller minorities include the Malays, who descended from Austronesian settlers, the Burghers, who are descendants of European colonists, principally from Portugal, the Netherlands, and the UK, and ethnic Chinese migrants who came to the island in the 18th and 19th century, and a smaller population who are descended from Africa. Several hundred thousands of Tamils left Sri Lanka and living mainly South India as refugees. It's been once it's been sometimes a burning issue in the South Indian politics too. That happened during the war in the past. Almost 30 years long war was there in Sri Lanka. Once around 200,000 Indian peacekeeping forces also arrived to Sri Lanka to create the process of peace, but they were failed and left. So it seems to be minorities having at end of seeking refugees in another country. As example, during the war period, in Sri Lanka, many Tamil people went to South India as refugees yet to be returned. Some Christians in Pakistan used to come to Sri Lanka and ask in refugee status, sometimes in order to migrate to a safer part of the world. Now there's a present situation, the COVID effect for minorities, also one of the point I like to explore. The COVID-19 pandemic is hitting South Asia during a period of sustained assaults by governments on the rights of minorities and the marginalized communities face severe obstacles in assessing their rights to nationality amidst rising majoritism nationalism across many parts of South Asia. Media and other right group activists highlights how numerous communities, including religious minorities, are denied official refugee or minority status by politicized and discriminatory citizenship laws, leaving them deprived of essential rights and services. This means that they are even more exposed to the worst impact of the pandemic now we are undergoing. Minorities in the region face a range of discriminatory exclusions and restrictions in relationship to citizenship, in breach of their international human rights, which also leaves them vulnerable to denial of other rights and access to basic services of the life, including, unfortunately, access to health care and information in their own languages during this pandemic crisis. Across many parts of the region, majority nationalism and divisive rhetoric are on the march, animating hate speech and targeted violence against minorities, as well as ongoing socio-economic exclusion likely to be further exacerbated amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, in Sri Lanka, the last year, April 21st, Easter Sunday, bombs attacks to major three Christian churches, major three hotels, killed several hundred of people, and that was planned by some extremist Islamic group. But fortunately, the situation of the violence uh, was not arised due to the immediate uh, addressing the people by the particular religious leaders, including the cardinal and other priests. But now the Easter Sunday Presidential Commission is going on, and the trying to have a fact-finding mission to control and also to settle the burning issues. It might targeted the minorities across. That some of the common problems to be addressed, I think, in this topic, the minorities of under siege in South Asia, the legal issues, the citizenship laws, acts, restrictions of movements and basic rights, securing fundamental rights, poverty and poor living condition improvements, and providing facilities. Also, the process to minimize the subject to the fear about crimes, rape, abductions, torture, extrajudicial killings, sometimes minorities have to be faced. The marginalization and limited access to essential services also to be a critical issue to be solved. Way forward for a better future for the minorities. I think firstly the all South Asian nations to accede to UN conventions on refugees and states statelessness to protect and support refugee populations. It recommends enacting comprehensive anti-discrimination laws, repealing those laws which discriminate, and introducing legislation that protects refugee populations. We urge the civil society to advance dialogues and initiatives further across the region to understand and address the issues facing by all minorities in South Asia. Secondly, the importance of good governance in showing how we can collectively pass the test of humanity, focusing the long-term future and stability of the of their countries. They emphasize now putting vulnerable groups at the forefront of all prevention, mitigation, and eradication efforts, irrespective of their identity, is key of realizing the incredible human vibrancy that exists in every country in our South Asian region. Thirdly, now we are in the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, the 30 period, the whole world. So the link with the Sustainable Development Goals, the targets, especially the goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions to address those the issues for minorities. Also, the fourthly, I would like to propose the strengthening the regional platforms. Officially, the SARC, uh, the intergovernmental platform. Also, we have many other civil society regional networks operating in South Asia. To them to consider, address, and find solutions for these minorities under siege in South Asia. Finally, the people's friendship and for peace and harmony, and bring justice, non-violence, and the human values, and better understanding about minority issues also important. So all these above 5 points, I wish to propose to consider in depth and to find a way out from this problem and way forward for a better future in South Asia. So once again, thanking the organizers, the South Asian Research Institute for Minorities, and all my fellow distinguished uh, speakers and uh, all listeners. I wish you all the best, the safe from this COVID-19 era, and we go forward for a better world and addressing these burning issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for such an informative presentation, highlighting the significance of South Asian region for different religion, covering the situation of Sri Lanka and your proposed solutions. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Mr. Pradip Pariyar as our next speaker. Mr. Pariyar is from Nepal. He is a social activist and the executive director of Samata Foundation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for organizing this, and thank you for having me here. And it's wonderful to listen to other panelists also. So under this minorities under siege in South Asia, I'm trying to bring the structural and caste discrimination in Nepal, which is a little bit maybe within the minorities. That's I heard a little bit issues of Dalit in other panelists also. That's good to hear that. But let me take all of you in Nepal, and then I'll talk more on structural and caste discrimination and violence in Nepal. So that's mostly focused on Dalit issues in Nepal. So origin of structural violence against Dalit in Nepal, how it's started, how it's going, and then I'll share a few stories. Let me share the origin of structural violence against Dalit in Nepal. The origin of caste-based discrimination in Nepal was after the promulgation of the Mulikian 1854 National or Civil Code commissioned by the Prime Minister Jangabahadur Rana that had a fourfold caste hierarchy and led to caste-based untouchability. And then King Mahendra later amended this national code in 1963, eliminating caste-based discrimination, though still it's a practice in these days also. However, the amendment didn't bring any change in caste-based discrimination and untouchability. So the caste-based discrimination and untouchability has been criminalized in Nepal. It continues to pervade virtually all level of society. That's continue going on, even though it's not exist in laws. Let me talk a little bit about the Dalit movements in Nepal. After the restoration of democracy in 1990, a lot of organizations led by Dalit emerged. Democracy movement and Dalit movement in Nepal has emerged parallelly. It's almost 70 years. As Dalit movement rose, the government formed the Dalit Commission back in 2002. Dalits had an important role during decade-long Maoist insurgency 1996 to 2006, as thousands of Dalit men and women participated in the armed conflict, and more than 1,500 Dalit killed in that armed conflict. The country headed to more participatory federal system post the Second People's Movement in 2006. The issues of Dalit have been covered on the national agenda, and the Dalit movement has gradually progressed, although it is yet to be institutionalized, which is not happening so far. The major achievement during the last decade has been the criminalization of caste-based discrimination through the Caste-Based Discrimination and Untouchability Crime Elimination and Punishment Act in 2011, and the Constitution of Nepal 2015, which is new constitution in Nepal, and then that's led for the Federal Democratic Republic country, Nepal. And 2015 constitution endorsed the right and opportunity for the Dalit for the upliftment, and that's some of the things written in the fundamental rights also. Moreover, the constitution recognized the National Dalit Commission as a constitutional body, and the National Dalit Commission Act 2017 was enacted to ensure opportunity for Dalits. Similarly, the Nepal Parliament has reserved certain seats for Dalits and other excluded community in the professional representation system, which is still not very effective. As per the election law, 13.8% of the proportional represented seat in the House of Representatives as well as the province assemblies are allocated for Dalits, while the 7 provinces must select at least one Dalit representative each among 8 chiefs. And now we have a 7 province government. We don't have a Dalit representative in that government. And in the federal government, there is a 25 minister and then only 1 minister in a cabinet. So much have been achieved at policy level and political level, but discrimination at societal level still exists. In recent times, the news broke out about the killing of 6 people from the Dalit community in Rukum West, as one of the victims tried to elope with the girl from higher caste, and then 6 people killed in the name of caste. So it's back in May. So during the pandemic time, this has happened, and then it's one of the crazy situation that shows from this incident. So at least 16 deaths have been reported in which victims were killed only because of their caste, since the new caste-based discrimination and untouchability offense punishment act 2011 came to enforce. And this is in the pandemic, there is a cases of at least 20 of caste-based discrimination were reported. At least 9 that have lost their life in the last 6 months. So during the pandemic, in the name of caste, and then 6 people killed. That's one of the ridiculous situation here. And 3 cases of custodial death of Dalit are also reported in the last 3 months in Nepal. So mostly in the police custody, and 84 cases of discrimination and violence against Dalit happened in 2019. So there have been 53 cases of discrimination or violence against Dalits in 2020. That means there's a lot of discrimination is happening, and then it's police brutality and caste-based violence is ongoing and continue. So one of the one of the young guy, Sambu Sada, on June 10, 2020, a 23-year-old Nepal truck driver from one of the municipality in Dhanusar district, and he died in police custody. Following Sada's death, his friends and family have been organized protests, rallies in Janakpur, demanding a fair and impartial investigation into the case. On June 11, Thursday, the day after Sada's death, protesters vandalized the area police office. Sada's body remained at the morgue in the Janakpur province hospital, and Sada's family has filed a complaint addressing Chief Minister at the province office of the National Human Rights Commission, demanding an impartial investigation into his death, but it's not happening. So this is one example of how this brutality is happening, and then caste-based and violence, discrimination and violence exists in Nepal. So there is another case I want to refer that Bijay Ram, 19-year-old custodial death at Garuda area police office. On August 16, 2020, police arrested Bijay Mohra along with his 10 other allied involved in murder that took place day earlier, which is not by these groups of people, but the area police arrest him and then torture him, and Bijay Ram died of torture at the hand of the police. The police didn't even let his family meet him when he was taken to the hospital. He died because the police beat him ruthlessly. However, police refused the allegation, and then still Bijay Ram waiting for the justice, and his death body in the one of the hospital in Kathmandu. So this kind of incident is happening all over Nepal, and then during the pandemic, during the crisis, and during this kind of corona situation, also people are practicing this this inhuman activities. That's one of the ridiculous situation. Most of the non-Dalits, let me talk about Alberta hegemony of the privilege. So most of the non-Dalits enjoy the privilege of being so-called superior caste, and so-called upper caste are often considered to be normative and ideal. When it comes to the discussion related to the caste questions, people often deny the privilege they retain for being so-called superior caste. And while Dalits are assumed to be inferior, or they are made feel inferior through various gestures and forms of communication, which is still exist, even though if you are staying in the village or in the cities, wherever you stay, that doesn't matter. But the different ways that people are practicing this. In most of the position of power, there are non-Dalits, especially upper caste like Brahmins. This doesn't mean all upper caste are powerful, but the trend is that always there are so-called upper caste holding the power at every sphere of the society. In Nepal context, there's only 8% Brahmin, but they capture more than 75% government authority. That they capture most of the civil servant, most of the politicians from this group. When Dalit occupies a position of power, that will be noted as an exception. It's very important to recognize and evaluate the non-Dalits, especially those who are considered upper caste, so-called upper caste, are holding the power because of their caste. So because of their caste, not because of their merit. People are talking about the merit also, and then they are always against the reservation. But if what I'm telling to them is, if they are super good, if they are super talented, if they are merit based, and then look at the South Asian countries, look at the Indias, how they are running that country, and then look at the Nepal, how they are running this country, one of the poorest country, and then million people are dying from hunger. So it's a crazy situation, and then they're telling themselves they are the merit best, and that they are the one very good one. They claim themselves in that way, but that's not true. And this kind of incident is happening, and then we started one movement here after the killing of the Navraj Bike and the rape and murder of Angira Pasi and the death of this Malar Sada and extrajudicial killing of Sambu Sada are but the reflection of statelessness, oppression of the vulnerable by the dominant so-called upper caste elites. 4 years ago, Ajit Midar was murdered for marrying a girl from so-called upper caste. His body still lies cold at Tribun university teaching hospital waiting for justice, and then these other bodies also waiting for the justice. And then we started this campaign, but from the back from the May, and then Dalit Life Matter Nepal is a movement to ensure justice to Dalits without the fear of being persecuted in the name of caste. We started that Dalit Lives Matter Nepal campaign, and then we inspired from the Black Lives Matter Nepal, Black Lives Matters also we inspired, and then we started this Dalit Lives Matters Nepal movement. So many more stories remain unreported and untold, and Dalit Lives Matter Nepal is inspired of by these untold stories and unheard voices of Dalits who have been vilified and persecuted by the Nepali society, state mechanism, and casteist mindset. The Dalits, it has started dialogue on social media platform, and then to move forward and achieve societal change, young people have shown a lot of positive response against the caste discrimination. Biggest hope for the Dalit movement can be achieved in the by engaging youth. So in Nepal and South Asia, if we want to make a change, we need to involve young people in this process. And then recently, now festival time running here in Nepal, and then this Hindu festival is going on. Today is the biggest day here in Nepal, and then 2 days back, and then just 2 days back, and then one of the mosques. One of the oldest mosques in Kathmandu, they just vandalized and then demolished from the few people. So nobody knows who did that, but that kind of things are happening here. So minority are a dangerous situation, especially in this time of era. So one of the things I suggest here through this platform, how can we make sure the marginalized groups alliance or allies, if we can make that and then if we can engage the young people, then we can make sure the change. Maybe we need to hold the hands for that. And then South Asia, our previous speaker also shared about the SARC. SARC is not now in coma, not functioning very well because of the big brother, so-called big brother, and then they're not doing anything in the SARC level also. So how can we push from the people's level to activate SARC also? That's also another things we can do. Let me stop here. Thank you for inviting. Maybe I don't know how much this relevant for this topics, but I always focus on Dalit issues. I'm working on these issues, so that's why I focus on these issues. Maybe this is helpful. I'm not sure. Thank you for listening, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much for explaining the structural and caste-based discrimination and violence in Nepal with a focus on Dalit issues. Thank you. Now I would like to request Ms. Radha Bheel, a social activist from Pakistan, to share her view with us.
सिंध पाकिस्तान से और मिरपुरखास से बिलोंग करती हूँ, और मैं दलित सुजाग तहरीक की चेयरपर्सन हूँ इस पाकिस्तान। और यहाँ पर जो हमारे दलितों के इशू हैं, और कुछ मैं आपको बताना चाहती हूँ कि जो कहाँ पर हमारे साथ ऐसा हुआ। तो पहले तो मैं थैंक यू करूँगी एशिया रिसर्च ऑर्गेनाइजेशन का। दलित सुजाग तहरीक बनाने का एक मकसद था, और क्यों हमने बनाई, इसलिए कि कुछ इश्यू ऐसे थे जो दलितों के साथ, और दलित यहाँ पाकिस्तान में हम लोग इनको दलितों को हम दलित नहीं कहते, क्योंकि जो ब्रिटिश ने जब ब्रिटिश जा रहे थे तो पाकिस्तान से, तो उन्होंने एक शेड्यूल दिया जो कि ऐसी जाति जो कि बिल्कुल ही प्रेस्ड है या मतलब बिल्कुल पुअर थी, उनको उन्होंने शेड्यूल दिया जिसमें 42 कास्ट आती हैं उसमें, जिसमें भील, कोली, मेघवाड़, जोगी, जंडावड़ा, सामी, कबूतरा, इस तरह के 42 कास्ट जो है उसमें आती हैं। तो हमारे यहाँ जो हमारा लॉ है या हमारा जो कानून है या हमारा जो सावधान है, उसमें जो है संविधान है, उसमें जो है हम उसको शेड्यूल कास्ट कहते हैं। तो शेड्यूल कास्ट जो है वो जब ब्रिटिश गए तो उन्होंने 5% कोटा हमारे लिए रखी थी दलितों के लिए। तो वहाँ जब जैसे कि 1998 में ऐसा हुआ कि एक कमेटी बैठी, और कमेटी में 4 मेंबरान थे, और उनमें से जो है एक फैसला आया कि जो है वो 5% कोटा जो दलितों को मिल रही है उसको अब शेड्यूल कास्ट को जो मिल रही थी उसको मर्ज करके माइनॉरिटी में किया जाए। और जब माइनॉरिटी में हम लोग हुए तो फिर हमें जो मराते मिल रही थी या हमें जो भी गवर्नमेंट पाकिस्तान की तरफ से जो अच्छा खासा एक 5% कोटा मिल रहा था वो हमारा जो है उसमें मर्ज होने के बाद जो है हम पीछे रह गए। तो ये जो है हमारे साथ एक हुआ। और उसके बाद अब ये है कि जब सेंसस होते हैं, एक तो हमारी जैसे बंटवारा हुआ उसके बाद जो है ना हमने बहुत सारी तकलीफें हम दलितों ने देखी हैं, पर बावजूद उसके कि हम जो है वो ठीक ट्रैक पे अब जा रहे हैं क्योंकि हमारे पास अभी एजुकेशन है और हम कहीं से आए नहीं हैं। यहाँ पर हमें जो एक एजाज है वो ये है कि हम कहीं और किसी और मुल्क से आए नहीं है क्योंकि हम सिंध के रहने वाले हैं और सिंध के बासी हैं। तो हमें ये एजाज हासिल है कि ये सिंध धरती हम दलितों की है या हम दरावड़ों की है या हम भील कोली मेघवाड़ जो भी है जो शेड्यूल कास्ट के लोग हैं उनकी है। तो हम यहीं पे रहने वाले हैं। मेरे हमारे जो बड़े थे या जो भी थे हम कहीं गए नहीं हैं और ना ही जाएंगे और ना ही कहीं से हम आए हैं। तो हमें जो है वो ये एहसास है। दूसरा ये है कि जब माइनॉरिटी में हमें मर्ज किया गया तो हमें वो फिर मराते नहीं मिलना शुरू हुई। यहाँ पर हमारे दलितों के साथ ये हो रहा है कि जो असेंबलियां हैं जो हमारे साथ जो डिस्क्रिमिनेशन है वो सियासी, समाजी और मुआशी है। उसमें हमारे साथ जो है वो असेंबली में आप देखें कि दलित का कोई वहां पर मतलब 1-2 बंदे हैं और वुमेन तो है ही नहीं क्योंकि 51% जो है वो औरतों की कोटा है हर उस लिहाज से। अगर हम दलित वुमेन पे जाएं तो फिर जो है ना हमारी कोटा और भी इसमें इजाफा होता है, लेकिन हमारी एक ही जो वुमेन है वो हमारी वहां पर सेनेटर है। तो वहां पर भी हमारे साथ ये है डिस्क्रिमिनेशन के हमारे असेंबलियों में ना कौमी ना सूबाई में हमारे साथ हमारे कोई भी दलित वहां पर वुमेन नहीं है खास तौर पे। और 1-2 जो है वो भी हमारी जैसे पॉपुलेशन है उस हिसाब से नहीं है। दूसरा ये है कि हम हमारी ये डिमांड है, हम अपनी गवर्नमेंट से डिमांड करते हैं कि हमारी जो दलित है कम्युनिटी है उनके साथ जो है वो उनको बजट दिया जाए, स्पेशली उनको 5% कोटा जो पहले ब्रिटिश ने रखी थी उसको बढ़ाकर अब जो है वो 10% की जाए क्योंकि हम माइनॉरिटी में मेजॉरिटी हैं जो दलित है। और हमारे जो मसीह बिरादरीन है उनके साथ भी डिस्क्रिमिनेशन है क्योंकि वो भी हमारे दलितों में ही आते हैं, उनके साथ भी बड़ा अन्याय होता है क्योंकि उसकी पोस्ट पे जो है वो कोई और बंदा आ जाता है, कोई कास्ट का आ जाता है, दूसरी कास्ट का, यानी कि वो मुस्लिम हो का जो हक है वो मर जाता है। उनको सैलरी नहीं मिलती और उनको सैलरी कम सैलरी में डेली वेजेस पे उनसे काम लिया जाता है क्योंकि वो जब दूसरा कोई मजहब का बंदा आ जाता है तो वो सफाई वाला काम, कर्मचारी वाला काम नहीं करता। तो उसके साथ भी बड़ा अन्याय होता है यहाँ पर। और सियासी समाजी मैंने क्या कहा कि मुआशी तौर पे हमारे साथ डिस्क्रिमिनेशन हो रहा है। हमारे जो है मंदिर है वहाँ यहाँ पर उनके ऊपर भी हमले हो रहे हैं, वो रियासत का काम है कि उसको ठीक करे। हमारी तरफ से कोई ऐसा रद्द अमल नहीं आ रहा, ना ही हम उसके ऊपर ऐसा कोई मतलब कर रहे हैं। मतलब हम जरूर शोक मना रहे हैं, हम जो है वो एक कंफ्यूजन का शिकार जरूर है, पर हम कोई ऐसा कदम नहीं उठाएंगे जिससे कि हमारे मुल्क और कौम और हमारे सिंध को कोई नुकसान पहुंचे। तो ये काम रियासत का है, उनको करना चाहिए। और ये भी ऐसा समझो कि डिस्क्रिमिनेशन है तभी तो वो मंदिरों पे हमले हो रहे हैं, लेकिन ये रियासत की जिम्मेवारी है, इसमें हम कुछ ठीक नहीं कहते। उसके बाद जो है वो हालात पे बिल्कुल थोड़ा सा अनकंट्रोल है, कोई कंट्रोल नहीं है, ये भी रियासत की जिम्मेवारी है। हमारी डिमांड है कि दलित जो वुमेन है खास तौर पे उसको जो है स्कॉलरशिप दी जाए और हमारे बच्चों को भी स्कॉलरशिप दी जाए। कोविड-19 में जो है जाहिर है पूरी दुनिया अफेक्टेड हुई है, तो खास तौर पे जो दलित बिरादरी जहां देखें तो बहुत ज्यादा जो है उनके ऊपर प्रेशर ये पड़ा है बेरोजगारी का, क्योंकि वो लोग जो है इतना कोई सियासी थे नहीं, ना कोई उनके पास कोई नौकरियां थी जो वो कमाए उनको सैलरी मिल जाए गवर्नमेंट की तरफ से। तो वो रोज का काम करने वाले लोग थे वो बेरोजगार हो गए। اور اس میں جو ہے وہ ہمارے دلتوں میں ابھی جو ہے وہ جو ہے سوسائڈ کا جو ہے وہ ریشہ بہت زیادہ بڑھ گیا ہے. فورس کنورژن فورس میرج تو کافی دن سے آ رہی ہے اور بھی کوئی اس میں کوئی خاص کوئی مطلب نہیں آیا ہے, اچھا کوئی رزلٹ نہیں آیا ہے. اور اس میں ایک اور ہمارا یہ ڈیمانڈ ہے گورنمنٹ سے کہ مائنارٹی کے جو ہمارے بندے ہیں جو اچھے کام کر کے گئے ہیں اور کر بھی رہے ہیں تو ان کا نصاب میں شامل ہونا ضروری ہے, کیونکہ وہاں جو ہیٹ مٹیریل شامل کیا جاتا ہے تو پھر ہمارے بچوں میں یہ نفرت آمیز جو ہے وہ مواد جب وہ پڑھتے ہیں تو پھر ہمارے چاہے وہ مسلم ہو چاہے نان مسلم ہو, پھر وہ آ کے سوال کرتے ہیں کہ کیا ہمارے ہندو جو ہیں یا ہمارے مائنارٹی ہے یا ہمارے دلت جو ہیں کیا ایسے لوگ ہیں. تو یہ ہماری ڈیمانڈ جو ہے ساری تقریباً جو بھی ہے ہماری ساری گورنمنٹ کو جاتی ہے, کیونکہ گورنمنٹ یا جمہوریت جو ہے ہماری جو جیسے جمہوریت ایک ماں کی طرح ہوتی ہے تو ہم ان سے ہی یہ ریکویسٹ کرتے ہیں کہ ہمارے جو ڈیمانڈ ہے وہ پوری کی جائے. اور دوسرا یہ ہے کہ جو ہمارے دلت 11 لوگ جو انڈیا میں مرڈر ہوئے ہیں ان کا ہم یہاں پر کافی لوگ بیٹھے ہوئے ہیں, سری لنکا ہے اور سنگاپور ہے, بہت سارے ممالک کے لوگ بیٹھے ہوئے ہیں اور اقوام متحدہ سے ہم اپیل کرتے ہیں کہ ہمارے جو دلت 11 لوگ جو مرڈر ہوئے ہیں انڈیا میں ان کا جو ہے وہ انصاف کیا جائے. اور ہم ڈیمانڈ کرتے ہیں اقوام متحدہ سے کہ یہ جو ہے ہماری جو ہے ریکویسٹ قبول کریں کہ ان کی فیئر جو ہے وہ جانچ کرائی جائے. ٹارچر کے حوالے سے اگر میں بولوں تو ہمارے ہاں گورنمنٹ کا تو اتنا ہمارے پر ٹارچر نہیں ہے, لیکن جو لینڈ لارڈ جو وڈیرے جس کو ہم بولیں ان کا جو ہے ہمارے ہاری لوگ ہیں یا فارمر لوگ ہیں ان کے اوپر تھوڑا بہت سننے والے جس ممالک سے تعلق رکھتے ہو ان سے بھی ہماری اپیل ہے کہ جو ہم دلت ہیں وہ مائنارٹی میں ہم میجورٹی ہیں تو ہم میجورٹی کے لیے جو ہے وہ کوٹا اور مختلف جو بھی سیاسی سماجی اور معاشی طور پہ ہماری جو ہے وہ ریاست کے ساتھ جو ہے ہماری یہ ڈیمانڈ ہے کہ ہمیں جو ہے وہ دیا جائے ہمارا جو حقوق ہے وہ اب کیونکہ ہم میجورٹی ہیں تو اب ہمیں 10% سے اباؤ دیا جائے. اور دوسرا یہ ہے کہ ہمارے جو سینسس ہے یہاں سے ہماری ڈسکرمنیشن شروع ہوتی ہے کہ جو سینسس ہے جب سینسس ہوتے ہیں تو وہاں پر جو ہے وہ 5 کالم بنے ہوئے ہیں اور 5 کالم میں سے مسلم ہے, ہندو ہے اور مسیح ہیں, پھر اس میں شیڈول کاسٹ آتا ہے. اب جو ہے ہماری جنتا کو ہمارے دلتوں کو ہمارے شیڈول کاسٹ کو اب تک یہ پتا نہیں ہے کہ ہم شیڈول کاسٹ ہیں, تو یہاں پر ہمارے ساتھ ڈسکرمنیشن ہوتا ہے. ہم کہتے ہیں کہ یہاں پر یہ جو گورنمنٹ ہے ہماری سرکار ہے اس کو یہ ہمیں بتانا چاہیے. ہمارے جو لوگ بالکل گاؤں میں رہتے ہیں جن کو پتا نہیں ہے, ریڈیو کے تھرو ٹی وی کے تھرو میسجز کے تھرو ہمیں یہ بتانا چاہیے جب سینسس آتے ہیں تب کہ یہ جو شیڈول کاسٹ ہو یہ آپ 42 جو جاتی ہو وہ ہو, تو ان کو پتا چلنا چاہیے کیونکہ ہم جو ٹک کرتے ہیں ہم جو سینسس میں جو ایک پروفارما جو ہے اس میں جو ٹک کرتے ہیں وہ ٹک ہندو پہ کرتے ہیں, اور جب ہماری وراثت جو ہوتی ہے وہ ہماری ہندو پہ ہوتی ہے, اور جب ہندو پہ ہوتی ہے تو ہم لوگ جو ہے وہ پھر رہ جاتے ہیں کیونکہ ہمارے شیڈول کاسٹ تو اتنے لوگ ہیں نہیں, وہ وہاں پر ہمارے سینسس کے اس میں نہیں آتا, گنتی جب سینسس کی جب گنتی ہوتی ہے تب نہیں آتا. تو یہ ہماری بھی گورنمنٹ سے ڈیمانڈ ہے کہ وہ جو سینسس کا جو فارم ہے اس کو لہذا آپ ٹھیک ڈیفائن کریں تاکہ ہمارے لوگوں کو پتا چلے کہ آیا ہم شیڈول کاسٹ ہیں یا ہم ہندو ہیں. جب یہ آتی ہے اپنی کوٹا کی بات آتی ہے تب مائنارٹی کی جب بات آتی ہے تو گورنمنٹ یا جو بھی ہمارے کاسٹ ہندوز ہیں وہ کہتے ہیں کہ ہمیں پورے حق ملے ہوئے ہیں. ہاں ہم کہتے ہیں کہ ہمیں پورے حق ملے ہوئے ہیں, لیکن وہ مائنارٹی کے اس وے میں, کیونکہ ہم مائنارٹی کے شیڈول کاسٹ ہیں. جب ہم شیڈول کاسٹ ہیں تو ہمیں وہ حق نہیں مل رہے کیونکہ ہمارے وہاں پر حق جو ہے وہ مائنارٹی میں چلے جاتے ہیں. تو گورنمنٹ سے یہ اپیل ہے کہ آپ شیڈول کاسٹ جو ہے اس کو ڈیفائن کرو, ان کو ان لوگوں تک پہنچاؤ اور ان لوگوں سے کہو کہ آپ لوگ جو ہے وہ شیڈول کاسٹ ہو, کیونکہ ہمارے لوگ اتنے پڑھے لکھے نہیں ہیں اور ایوانوں میں بھی نہیں ہے. اور جہاں پر لیجسلیشن ہوتی ہے یا قانون بنتے ہیں, جب قانون بنتے ہیں تو ظاہر ہے پھر اپر ہندوز کے قانون بنتے ہیں اور اپر ہندوز میں پھر وہ آتے ہیں گتا کے لیسنس, یعنی کہ جو آپ تو سمجھ رہے ہو کہ ان کو پرمٹ مل جاتی ہے. مطلب جو ہمارے مائنورٹی کے وہاں پر اسمبلی میں بیٹھے ہوئے ہیں ان کو کوئی اچھی وزارت ملنی چاہیے, माइनॉरिटी की हुई मिलनी चाहिए, क्योंकि दलित तो वहां है नहीं। एजुकेशन मिलना चाहिए, कोई हेल्थ मिलना चाहिए, कोई ऐसा ऐसा डिपार्टमेंट हो जिससे हमारी तरक्की हो। हमारी तरक्की के लिए जो है ना, उनको अच्छा डिपार्टमेंट देना चाहिए, क्योंकि ये जब गुत्ते वाली बात आती है, शराब वाली बात आती है, कहते हैं हिंदूज में अलाउ है, हिंदूज में कहीं अलाउ नहीं है। और हमारी डिमांड है कि हमें ये जो है ना, ये लाइसेंस हमें नहीं दिए जाए, और हमें हमारे जो लोग वहां पर बैठे हैं, वो खासतौर पे दलित जो एक दो बैठे हुए हैं, उनको जो है वो कोई ऐसी वजारत दी जाए जिससे हमारा अच्छा हो। और हम गवर्नमेंट से डिमांड करते हैं कि हमें, क्योंकि हम जो बिल्कुल ही मतलब एक गरीब तबका है, एक पिसा हुआ तबका है, एक दलित तबका है, उसको माइनॉरिटी में उसको ज्यादा नहीं लाओ, उसको खास जो है मराद देकर उसको आगे लाओ। उनकी वुमेन 1% भी पढ़ी लिखी नहीं है, उनकी वुमेन एक डॉक्टर, हमारे यहाँ अभी अभी 2 डॉक्टर हुई हैं, कोई हमारी इंजीनियर नहीं है दलित, कोई हमारी जो है वो पायलट नहीं है। तो उनको खास मराद दी जाए, हमारी वुमेन्स को कोई खास जो है वो रियायत दी जाए, ताकि हम लोग जो है वो आगे आ सकें। थैंक यू खुरम।
Thank you, ma'am. Here I would like to quickly summarize her speech in English. She demanded justice for recent killing of 11 Dalits in India. She said that the situation of minorities in Pakistan is improving. Then she also said that people belonging to the scheduled caste are unaware of their identity and they are unable to identify themselves as scheduled caste. Therefore, they are unaware of the benefit of reserve quota by the government in government job. So she urged the government to take steps to make them aware in this regard. Then she said that special educational packages should be announced by the government to encourage the children of scheduled caste to get professional education. Moreover, she also said that forced conversion may be stopped through law and the orientation of religious persons about the true interpretation of their religion.
Now we will have few questions from the audience.
Question is for Mr. Pradip. What is the actual situations of minorities in Nepal?
Thank you so much for questions. Actually, I already mentioned about the minorities. Within the minorities, Dalit are one of the most minorities within the minorities. But there is a Madhesis and there is a Janjati and ethnic groups also in the minorities. Only the Brahmin and Kshatri, their population is around 23%, and they are the holding the most of the places. So still, these minority groups are fighting for their right, especially in the constitution making process in 2015. These minority groups raised a lot of voices, especially from Tharu communities, Madhesis communities, but their voices was not heard during the constitution assembly time also. So still, this fight are ongoing, and then how I address this movement minority issues is this is not marathon. I call this is a relay race. So we need to continue fight for this, and the situation is worse, but we need to make an alliance, and maybe we need to fight for our rights. That's necessary things in my opinion.
My question is from Dr. Manish. Sir, what should be done in South Asia for upbringing of minorities like Dalits and Muslims?
As a professor, I will say that education. There is nothing that can really meet the crux and the power of education in uplifting the minorities. That's number one point. The other point that I would say, which I actually spoke in the last week's session, it is also the role of majority to understand and sympathize with the problems, with the issues, with the discrimination that happened with the minority population. Education can also go as far as obviously possible, but unless the people which we call the haves and the haves not, right? So the haves is the majority, the have nots is often the minority. So until the haves or the majority, until they don't recognize and they don't sympathize with the pain of the minority population, that can also be problematic in my view. So having creating that understanding. And how do you do that? With creating these dialogues, right? Creating these dialogues of bringing people from different faiths, different ideologies, different value system, majority and minority, and let them talk to each other and let them understand. Me being, I think what I spoke last week was about, me being a typical, like it quote unquote, Hindu Punjabi, from Delhi. I mean, I was a socially majority, but economically I was a minority because I lived in a one bedroom house with five people. So therefore I had that lens of, even though socially I never faced the discrimination per se, but economically I faced a lot of things which would, which would put me which would give me some bit of understanding of, what it is like. So bringing the groups together and having them talk to each other, I think is another idea that I would definitely put it out. And obviously I think the somewhat I go back to the media role also. The media is the vehicle of our voices, like you guys are doing such a wonderful symposium, the conference here. Now these voices have to get out to the larger, to the larger community. People should talk amongst their own families, like we, coming from the families that we do, we talk, we discuss about several issues. There are divisive issues. Many people fail to recognize their privileges also, and that is one other thing that I would say, that as a minority, people don't, or as a majority, people often don't understand their privileges, because they have never lived without the means, right? So they don't know what is it to live like without the means. So for even for majority to recognize the privileges is also a very critical part of it. So just to sum it up, education, right? Having the minority sympathize with that, and having majority also to understand their own sense of entitlement and their own sense of privileges, would also be one angle that I would definitely say. And then using media to bring those discussions out in the public. Like I was really impressed by Pradip's comments from Nepal, and Radha's from Pakistan, where there's so much for me to learn also today. So I think these conversations can also help in that process.
In the end, I extend a very hearty vote of thanks to all speakers, Professor Dr. Manish Madan, Dr. Sir Deshapriya S. Wijetunge, Mr. Pradip Pariyar, and Ms. Radha Bheel for gracing your important work and sharing with us your finding and opinion today. Protection of minorities is not only vital to enhance solidarity in diverse societies, but it is also very essential to achieve democratic security, sustainable development, and peace. In Pakistan, all human beings have their rights, and it is moral obligation as well as religious duty of the state to protect human rights of all the human beings. Citizens enjoy private as well as public rights. No one is allowed to snatch these rights. There is no any discrimination, differentiation, injustice, or partiality on the basis of caste, religion, and birth. Minorities are given special quota in employment as well. Protection of national minorities, rights and freedom of member of minorities are all part of international protection of human rights. To conclude, international and national institutions, non-governmental organizations working together on minority issues or minority rights should review the extent to which they integrate minority issues into their work with a view to strengthening their attention to these issues of minorities. Firstly, the recognition that problem exists, that there are disadvantaged communities who are deeply and negatively affected by activities that may benefit some, but not all is essential. Secondly, it is important to have the data that reveals the extent of problem facing minorities if states and others are going to design effective program for change. Finally, it is vital that the political will exist to make the change real and to make commitment to addressing discrimination, exclusion, and to creating equality. Thank you everyone for joining us today. May God bless us all.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.